Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's been a few weeks since I last posted an update for the Blazor blog tutorial, so we're going to continue with that today. So far we've taken a brand new project, added entity framework, set up API controllers, set up the Blazor front end, added some forms and validation. So in this episode, I think it's time that we did a little bit of refactoring to get this project ready for production, which is the ultimate aim of this course. So in this episode, we'll add some services, we'll introduce some command and query separation, and we'll introduce some logging as well. So let's get started. So over in the server project, the first thing that I'm going to do is add a directory, and I'm going to call that slices. The reason I'm going to call that slices is because I'm going to introduce what's known as vertical slices. So if you don't know, vertical slices are a way of grouping related functionality together to make it easier for the developer to find and maintain that code going forward. So rather than having code all over the place that might relate to the same thing, if you keep everything together in one slice, then it makes it a lot easier to find and maintain that code. And I found this really useful for projects that I've worked on in the past. So the first slice that we're going to add is going to be called blogs. So we've added a new directory called blogs in our slices directory. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to come into the domain directory and I'm going to move the blog entity that we created in one of the earlier episodes, and I'm going to move that into the blogs slice. So that's our entity added. I'm then going to come into the persistence directory in the configurations, and I'm going to move the blog configuration into there as well. So you can start to see that we're getting the things that are related to blogs and having them all in this one location makes it a lot easier to find. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some extra directories in here just to make it even cleaner. So I'm going to add one for configurations and put the configuration in there. And I'm also going to add one for entities, and we'll put that blog entity in there as well. So with our database entity and our configuration file moved over into our new slices directory, let's go and take a look at the blogs controller. Now here we can see that we're making our database queries directly in the controller, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it doesn't scale very well. It's not very maintainable in that if we want to be able to get a blog from somewhere else in our code as the project grows, there's going to be no easy way to do that. And we don't want to replicate the code to retrieve a blog from the database in multiple different places, because if the way that we get a blog changes, we're going to have to remember to update all of those locations. And a lot of the way I code is to keep things as simple as possible by having one single source of truth. So in order to get a blog, we need one single source of truth of how do we get that blog. Whether we're coming in from the controller or whether we're calling it from somewhere else within our code, there should be one central place to do that. And that's where we introduce services. So let's go over into our blogs slice and let's add a service, blog service. And I'm also going to add an interface called iBlog service. And then we will add the interface to our service like so. And then I'm going to come over to our program CS, and I'm going to add our new service to the services collection. So we'll say builder.services.add scoped iBlog service, and then the implementation will be blog service. Now, if you're unsure about dependency injection in .NET, I've made a video about that recently, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. So with that added and connected up, let's go back over to our blog service. And if we bring the controller up to one side so we can see both, we're going to create our first method on our blogs service. So the first one will be called getAll. So let's take this as our starting point and copy that over into our blog service. We'll need to introduce the blog data context through the constructor. So let's add that here. And then the return type, rather than action result, which is a controller thing, we're just going to return the list of blog DTO. And we'll need to add the reference for that too. And instead of returning OK, which again is a controller thing, we'll just return the blogs. So now we have our first method on the blogs service, which is the getAll method, and we'll be able to call this from anywhere within our code to get all of the blogs. And then over in the controller, we can remove the blog data context as we won't need that anymore. And instead we can inject in the blog service. And then in the getAll method, we will just simply call the blog service.getAll async And then we just need to add that to our interface. So we will rename the method here to make sure it's get all async. And then let's copy this line and put this in our interface. So over in our interface, we just take away the public async and add the reference. And there's our first method on the interface. There's our first method set up in the service. And we can see over in the controller that is now happy getting all of the blogs via the blog service. So we'll do the same with the others. So I'll take the get by ID, bring that over into the service, take away the action result. So it's just blog DTO. And then it doesn't matter if it's not found, we can just simply return the blog as this is showing nullable. So if the blog is not found, it will just simply return null from the service. So we'll add that to our interface as well. So let's come over to here, take away the public async. So there's our method on the interface. And then over in the controller, we'll change this part here to use our blog service.getById, pass the ID in. In fact, I'm going to rename that to getById async. And then here we'll check if it's null, we'll return not found like before. Otherwise, we return it in an OK response. Okay, with those first two methods complete, let's move on to the add method. So let's copy the method and bring that over into our service. I'm going to remove the return type, so it's just a task. And I'm going to rename this to add async. We'll also bring in the reference for the command. And then we will simply remove the return at the bottom there and add this method to our interface. Again, bring in the reference here. And then over in our controller, let's change this to be await blog service.add async and pass in our command. And then we can simply return created. Okay, with that one complete, let's move on to the update method. Again, I'll copy that, bring that over to our service. And then what I'll do is I'm going to change the return type this time to be a true or false, so we know if it succeeded or not. And then I'm going to rename this to update async. So again, it will go to the database, find the blog, and if that's null, we're going to return false. And if it is found and we're able to complete the update, we will then return true at the bottom here. So let's add that to our interface. And then let's come over to our controller and update the code here. So this will change to blog service.update async and we'll pass through the command. And then the return will be is successful. And so if it's not successful, we know at the moment with our blog service, the way it's configured, the only way it wouldn't be successful, other than an exception being thrown, would be that the blog didn't exist. So for now, we'll keep it that if it comes back as not successful, it will return not found. However, there are some better ways of being able to actually get the information from the service as to the reason it failed. But to keep the scope of this particular video down, I'm going to just leave it like this for the time being, and that perhaps is something that we can come on to in other episodes. And then if it is successful, we will return OK like before. And then finally, let's do the same with the delete method. So I'll copy that, bring it over into our blog service, and I'm going to add that here. And then here we again will return a true or false, and I will call this delete async. Again, if it's not found, we'll return false, and if it is successful, we'll return true. Let's add that to our interface. And then let's come over to our controller and change this to be blog service, delete async, and we'll pass in our ID. This becomes is successful. And then again, if it's not successful, we'll return not found. And if it is successful, we'll return OK. So that's our controller updated to now use the service. And hopefully you can see how if we now need to get that information, or maybe to add a blog or update a blog, delete a blog from anywhere else within the application, we can now just request the iBlog service, and we'll be able to make those changes from anywhere within the application, not just from within the controller. So I'm now going to make the same changes to the blog's post controller to make a blog posts service, and I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, so I've done the same thing with the blog posts controller, and if we take a quick look through, you can see I've replaced each of the methods in exactly the same way with a blog post service instead. So now we have a central location where we can manage blog and blog posts using the service from anywhere within our code. And you can also see that I've created a new slice called blog posts, and in there, just the same as I did with blogs, I've added the configuration from the persistence directory, I've added the entity from the domain directory, and I've now deleted the domain directory, and we have the blog post service with the iBlogPost service interface. And again, also in Program CS, I've added another line here, which is to add the scoped iBlogPost service. Okay, so with that refactoring complete, the next thing I'm going to suggest we do with this project is to remove the controllers. And instead, let's opt for something which promotes a little bit cleaner separation between our endpoints. So let's come over into our server project. I'm going to right click and go to Manage NuGet Packages, and I'm going to add a package called FastEndpoints. So let's install that into the server project. And with that installed, let's go over to our program CS. And up here where it says builder.services.add controllers, I'm going to remove that and instead say builder.services.add fast endpoints. And then I'm also going to add in an options here, and in the options I'm going to say include abstract validators true. So with that added, I'm also going to come down to the bottom here, and where we are saying app.map controllers, I'm going to change that to app.useFastEndpoints. So that's the only changes we need to do in order to start using fast endpoints in our project. And next thing I'm going to do is in our slices directory, in our blogs, I'm going to add a new directory here, and I'm going to call this commands. In here, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call that add blog handler. So this is going to be our single location for managing the add blog endpoint. So first of all, let's add a base class of endpoint. And in there, I'm going to pass in the add or update blog command, which is what our current add blog endpoint requires. So I'm going to also add a reference here to fast endpoints. So the next thing we're going to do is override a method from fast endpoints called configure. So we'll say public override void configure. Okay, so in here is where we can tell fast endpoints how we want this endpoint to be configured. So let's open our blogs controller and bring that up to the other side. If we go down to our add method, we can see that again, we're taking the add or update blog command, which we have here, and we can see that this is a post to this endpoint here. So let's, in our configure method, we're going to say post, and then we're going to copy this root from here, and we're going to paste that in here. We may need to add our references. So I think this will need to be shared.constants.roots.api.blogs.add. And then I'm also going to add a line which says allow anonymous. So in a future episode, we will cover authentication and how to actually protect your endpoints to ensure only certain users will be able to access them. But at the moment, since we don't have any authentication in our application, we're just going to go with allow anonymous to continue the same functionality we currently have. And so with our configure method complete, the other method we want to override is the handle method. So we'll say override handle async. So this is the method that is called by fast endpoints when a request is received for this endpoint. So this is where you actually process your request. So just like in our controller, we're going to call the blog service. So we'll copy this over, and let's rename this parameter here to be command. And here is the cancellation token. And so let's inject our blog service. So I'm going to say iBlog service, and then we will make this async, and then just like in our controller, we'll need to return created, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the add blog handler, and I'm going to call this one update blog handler. So this has the same command, because remember we have an add or update blog command, and we just need to update the name of the class here. And then for the update, if we go over to our controller, we can see that our update is a HTTP put. So over in our update blog handler, we will change this method to put, and then we will change the root from add to update. Then over here in the handle method, we will simply change it to be the update async method. And if we check our controller, we can see we were also checking if it came back successful or not. If it didn't, we say not found. And if it is, then we return OK. So we'll take that logic and we'll bring that over to our update blog handler. And we will add the variable here. And then if it's not successful, the way we return not found with FastEndpoints is to call await send not found async, and we can pass the cancellation token there as well, and then we just simply return. And then here to return OK, we simply call await send OK async, and again passing the cancellation token. So that's the update blog handler complete. Now I'm going to add a new directory in the blogs directory, and I'm going to call this queries. And in here, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call this getBlogById handler. So this one's going to be a query. So you can start to see that we're starting to separate the commands from the queries. So what's known as command and query separation, or command and query responsibility segregation, CQRS. So the idea of this is to keep all of your commands, which actually make things happen, which instruct the service to do something, separate from your queries, which only retrieve data and should have no actual impact on the service, shouldn't actually cause any action to occur. So queries actually pull read-only data from the service, commands actually instruct something to happen and cause a knock-on effect. By keeping them segregated like this, it can make it really easy to locate the code that you're looking for and to understand the potential implications of calling a certain endpoint. I know in my code that if I call any query, it's not going to have any impact on anything other than retrieving the data from the database. If I know that if I call a command that I expect something to happen and that a change will occur because of that command. So I think it makes it very clear in code, but also in maintainability to be able to find the code that you're looking for. And together with vertical slices, I know that everything, including the commands and the queries, the service, the entity, everything I need to do with a blog is in here, and anything to do with a blog post is in here. And as your project starts to grow, and you've got several of these with different areas of your project, it makes it really easy and predictable to find exactly what you're looking for. And I've also found that if developers join your project at a later date, then once they've got used to that general structure, they find it very easy and predictable to be able to find where other things are within your code base. So I've certainly found this the best way to go. So let's add the getBlogById handler. So this one's slightly different because this is our first query using FastEndpoints, but we're still going to inherit a class from FastEndpoints, but this time it's going to be endpoint without request. Okay, and the reason for that is that we don't have a command like before, so we don't have an object that we're actually sending into the server. So before we had the add or update command, which is the object we're actually sending in. This time we are only asking for a blog by its ID, and the ID for the blog that we want is in the root of the endpoint. So there is no actual body of the request. So we say endpoint without request. And then in here, we actually specify what the return type will be. Well, if we're getting a blog by ID, we know that's going to be the blog DTO, and we're going to make that nullable because the blog that you're asking for may not exist. So if we go over to one of our existing handlers and copy the configure method and bring that in here, we then will need to change this to get. And if we bring up our blogs controller to one side, we can ensure we set it up correctly. So this will be the getById method. So we can see it's a get here, so that matches here. And we can see this is the root here, so we'll update this bit. And again, we're going to leave it as allow anonymous for now. And then we just need to override the handle method. So again, it will be override handle async, and we'll rename this to cancellation token. And then in here, Notice this time it doesn't pass in any command because again, we don't have a command. So we just have the cancellation token. So then in the constructor, we'll add in the iBlog service. And in the handle method, we will copy our logic from here, bring that over, and we'll make this async. So we will then say if the blog is null, we're going to return not found again. So we can say await send not found and then return. And if it's successful, we can say await send OK async, and we can pass in the blog and the cancellation token. So it's doing exactly the same as our controller, but we're doing it here in this handler. So the last thing we need is to be able to get the ID. So to be able to get an ID from a root parameter, if we look at the getById root, we can see that the root contains the ID of the blog that we wish to retrieve. So to get that out, we need to take note of the parameter name, which in this case is ID in lowercase. And then what we can do is we can say var ID equals root, and then you specify the type. So in this case, we know it's a GUID, and then we specify the name here. So that will retrieve a root parameter with the name ID as a GUID, and then we can pass that into our service. Okay, so with that one complete, I'm going to duplicate the getBlogsById handler, and I'm going to call this one getAllBlogs handler. And then let's change this. Let's close the other windows. And let's change the return type because we know we're going to return a list of blog DTO, which is not nullable. It's still going to be a get, but the endpoint will be get all. It's still going to be allow anonymous for now. There is no root parameter with this one, so we can delete that. Let's change this method to the get all method, and this becomes blogs plural. There always will be something, even if it's an empty list, and then we return that in an OK response. So hopefully you can see how this keeps them a lot cleaner and tidier. I think the last one we need to add before we can delete our blogs controller altogether will be the delete method. So we can see that that is a delete, and it's the delete endpoint. So let's come over to command because of course we're causing something to happen. So it's a command. So we're going to say, let's actually duplicate one we've already got. So let's duplicate the add blog handler. I'm going to call this delete blog handler. And in here, let's call that delete blog handler. So here we're going to need to change this to delete and the actual root to delete. And we also know that, again, this is actually an endpoint without request. And this time we don't return anything either, so we will just say endpoint without request. Then we'll need to remove the command from the handle method. And again, this is a bit like the getById where it has a root parameter. So if we go over to our getById, we can copy this and bring this into our delete blog handler. So there's the ID of the blog to delete. And then we'll say blog service delete async, and we'll pass through the ID. And then if we look over in our blogs controller, we can see that we're checking if it's successful, and if it's not, we return not found. So let's do the same in our handler. So I'll say is successful equals the result from the service. If it's not successful, we will await send not found async, pass in the cancellation token and return. If it is successful, we will await send OK async. And again, we'll pass in the cancellation token. So there we are. We now have a handler for each of the endpoints, and we can now actually go ahead and delete the blogs controller altogether. Okay, so I've gone ahead and done the same thing with blog posts, and I've now deleted the controllers altogether. So if we take a look at the server, we can see we have the slices directory, and in there we have two slices. We have the blogs and we have the blog posts. If we go into blogs, we can see what commands are available. We know we can add, update, and delete one. We can also see what queries are available. We can get by ID, or we can get all of them. We have our entities and our entity configurations here as well. We also have our blog service and blog service interface. So everything required to run and interact with the blog's functionality is all in that one slice. And it makes it very quick and easy to be able to see what functionality is available by looking at the commands and queries. So I can see that we can add one, update one, delete one, etc. But I can see that there isn't one that might, I don't know, change a status, or there might be one that sends a notification. Very quickly looking at these directories, you can see exactly what functionality is available. And I just find it makes it really easy to understand and makes it really predictable for the developer. So then if we look in our handler, we can see it's nice and clear. This is just one handler that only handles this one particular request. We can see it's handling a post to this particular endpoint. We can see that it takes this command and it returns something. This particular endpoint should return the created response. So this is the one that I mentioned earlier that I said we'll come back to. So the reason for that is that we needed the getById handler to be created before we could finish this one off. So let me show you what I mean by that. So when we call our add method, we want it really to return the ID of the new blog that it's just added. So if we go over to the blog service, we can see we're mapping our command to a blog, we're giving it a new ID, adding it to the database and saving it, but we're not telling the user the ID of the new blog. So here, let's return the blog.id and then change the return type here to be a task of GUID instead. And we can change that on the interface as well. And then in the handler, we now have the ID of the new blog that's been created. And then what we can do is we can then call await send created at async. And this is a way of telling the consumer, the client, where to find that new entity that's just been created. And in here, we can pass in the name of the handler for getting a blog by its ID. So get blog by ID handler. So in here, we now need to pass through the parameters required by that handler. So the get blog by ID handler just takes the ID of the blog, so we can just pass in ID. Then the second parameter is the information we want to be in the body of the response, which again, for now, we can just say ID. And then finally, we can set the cancellation token to cancellation token. So with that done, let's also take a look at the add blog post handler. And you can see in here, I'm getting the ID back from the blog post service. So this is the ID of the blog post we've just created. And then I'm directing the user to send created at, directing them to the get blog post by ID. And in here, the get blog post by ID handler takes the blog ID and the ID of the post. So I passed in the same naming conventions here. I passed in a new object with blog ID and the ID in it. So we've now got services in our application to be able to centralize the management of our blogs and our blog posts, and we're able to call that from anywhere within our application. And we've also now got rid of our controllers, and instead we've gone with vertical slice architecture with the command and query segregation, making it a lot more easier to maintain, and I think a lot easier to find the code that you're looking for when actually developing in the application as well. So the final part I want to cover in this episode is let's add some logging. Logging is a really important part of any application to be able to find out what went wrong, when it went wrong, and why. And I actually find it really, really useful to actually have the application almost read out what it's doing step by step, so that when something does go wrong or you're unsure about why you're getting a particular response, you're able to see exactly what's going on and where that error might be occurring. So let's take a look at our blogs service we created earlier. If we go over to our blog service, and let's inject in the constructor, we're going to add an iLogger. So as part of .NET Core, you're able to use the iLogger interface, and that's all set up for you out of the box. And in here, you just specify the type of the logger, which is really just used for naming. So here we pass in the name of the service that we want a logger for, which is the blog service. And I'm just going to call that logger. So then let's go over to our get all async method. And in here, I'm going to add some logging so that when this method is called, we can actually see that it was called. Now, the amount of logging that you need to do is really a personal preference. And it also depends on what's happening with those logs. If it's just going to be displayed in the console while it's running, or is it going to actually be exported out to a centralized server somewhere. So the amount of logging that you do is really down to you and the environment that you're coding in. But I personally like to be able to see at least the flow of the logic. So I typically here would add a logger to say log information, and then I'm going to say here getting all blogs. And then after that's completed, I'm going to add another one here to say logger.log information, and then in here I'm going to say that X number of blogs retrieved. And then I'm going to pass in the blog count. So here I'm going to say blog count. So now if there was some kind of error whilst retrieving the blogs from the database, we're first going to see the message saying getting all blogs, and then there would be an error or the application would stop or whatever, and we'd be able to quite easily determine that if we never saw this message, that the error must have occurred here. So logging can be a really powerful thing. Also, what you could potentially do here as well is you could add a try and catch block. So I'm going to move all of the code inside the try block, and let's align that. So we're going to get the stuff from the database, log that we've retrieved, and return the blogs. Now, if there's an exception, that will come down into here, and I'm then going to call this exception. So in here, we can now log that there was an error. So instead of log information, I'm going to choose logger.log error. And that takes the exception and a message, in this case, failed to get blogs. And if there is an error, I'm just going to return an empty list. So now we know if we call the getAll method from anywhere within our application, that it isn't going to throw an exception. If there is any kind of error, the worst that's going to happen is it's going to return an empty list, and any errors will be shown in the log. So I've gone ahead and I've done the same thing with the blog posts service. So now if we take a look, we can see that we have our logging in each of these methods. So each of them are going to try the code in here first, and then if there is some sort of error, each of them will now log that out. So each of these methods now clearly show exactly what's happening in the log as it happens. And for example, if we look at the update method, where we're checking for an existing post to update, if that returns null, then I add a warning to the log to show that that particular blog post was not found. So now let's give it a run and see what happens. So over in our app, if we go over to the blogs page, and I'm going to add a new blog. So everything should continue to work as before, because everything we've done today is refactoring. So we get the same functionality that we had before, but in a much cleaner and more maintainable and production ready way. So let's add in a test description, and that's gone through fine. So that's good. Let's make sure we can still update a blog. So we'll save a change there. Yep, that's showing. Let's go into the posts and let's add a post. And I'm going to say test. And yep, that's gone through fine as well, and we can still view it as well. So everything's still working. Let's go and have a look at the logs. So now if we look at the logs and we scroll back to the top here, after the application started and we went onto the page, we can see here that the blog service has reported the getting all blogs message. So we know that that was when we first went onto the blogs page, and we can then see Entity Framework is making this database query here. And then we can see that the blog service returned 0 blogs retrieved. So we can now actually follow the logic of the application step by step. So as I mentioned, if an error was to occur, we will clearly be able to see at what point in the logic flow of the application did that occur, simply by adding a few extra lines to our application. So there is a lot more to logging than we've gone into here, and that might be something that I do a video on in the future. If you'd like to see that, then please put a comment down below and let me know. However, whilst we're here, there is one common mistake that I see people making with logging, and we'll just go over that now. So here, where we're passing in this blog ID, so the message shows that we're getting the blog posts by this particular ID. So notice that I'm using a placeholder here, and I've given it the name of blog post ID, and then I'm passing that parameter in as a separate value. So a lot of people will do this instead. So they'll use string interpolation, and they'll just put the ID in here and then don't pass it in the second parameter. So this looks fine, and it is normal C# to use string interpolation like this, and it will still print out the same message in the log, but there is a difference. So this version here will actually be created as a static string within your application at build time. So it's a lot more performant than the second version, which will need to be created fresh every time to put your value in. Whereas this version is used as a template, and then the values that you pass in here are populated where the placeholders are. So this ID will be put here, for example. Secondly, the first version with the template allows you to give a name to what that argument is. So for example, I might have a log message with 3 or 4 parameters, and it allows me to say that this is the blog post ID, this might be the blog ID, this might be the user ID. And by actually giving it a name, which you can see Rider is highlighted in purple here, that actually gives that parameter a meaning. So in certain logging applications, if we were to export these logs to an external location, we'd actually be able to filter through the logs and find all of the logs where the blog post ID value equals a certain value, or the user ID value equals a certain value. But you wouldn't be able to do that with the second option because there is no parameter name. So I hope this video has been useful for you. I hope you've learned something from the various refactorings that we've done. This is a lot more in line with some of the code that I tend to write on a daily basis. So I hope that you've learned something from this. And of course, if you have, then please do give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you get notified when I post more videos. Also, let me know in the comments down below what sort of videos you'd like to see in the future, and I will try and get those made for you. Have a good day.